Test 1, 2, hallo?
Schon fast zu laut. Ja, schon fast zu laut auf dem Monitor. Wird Train ein Echo geben. Okay. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our 6 p.m. talk. I have with me here Ms. Stephanie Alekram. She's telling you a bit about her talk. There's gold in the circuit boards. It's based on her master's thesis, and it's related to the kind of technology we use, but also the part of it we don't normally recognize. The waste and the recycling. Please give it up for Stephanie.
Hi everybody, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you to everyone who's here, and thank you to the CCC organizing team. I'm so impressed with this whole organization. This is my first time in Germany, my first time at a CCC event, and this has just been great. So my talk is called "There's Gold in Them Circuit Boards," but there's also a lot of other interesting stuff in them, like silver, gold, neodymium, all sorts of stuff. So the reason that I get to stand up here is by trade, I'm a system administrator, a Linux system administrator, and I just got my master's in environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania. So I'm half geek, half tree hugger. I also do some hackerspace organizing. Right now, my home hackerspace is the Hacktory in Philadelphia. I've done a lot of volunteering with community radio organizations, and I love plants, I love bikes, and my master's thesis was on electronic waste, and specifically what happens with what has happened with rare earth oxides and rare earth elements in electronic waste. So that's me. So the structure of the talk is going to be, I'm just going to kind of do a little quick primer for those of you who aren't too familiar with the topic. For those of you who are, just get on Twitter, play Farmville or something for a couple minutes, and we'll catch back up. Then I'm going to go through the actual physicality of waste, of e-waste. Then I'm going to talk about the value that's embedded in it. I'm going to talk about later what the future of e-waste ought to be and probably will be. And then last, what we as technology workers can and ought to be doing about the whole issue. So, the basics. What is electronic waste? In the EU, it's referred to as waste electronic and electrical equipment. And there are obvious examples like, when this laptop goes to the big hard drive in the sky, it'll be electronic waste. When my cell phone dies, it'll be electronic waste. But there are a lot of other less obvious examples like computerized toys, car parts, old appliances. A lot of these things have circuit boards in them. And under different definitions, different municipal definitions, those things might all be considered electronic waste. So let's go through the life cycle of how a device, a shiny new device, becomes something that you throw in the trash. So say a user goes out and buys a new computer. So she picks it up or has it delivered or whatever, she pulls it out of the box and throws away the packaging. So already, before she's even logged into the computer, she has transferred the waste of the packaging from the manufacturer to her municipal waste system. So the manufacturer now no longer has responsibility over even the packaging waste, and the computer isn't even open yet. So then, she goes and she uses it for maybe 3, 5, 7 years, and she puts it in power safe mode, and she tries not to print too much. But what she might not know is that some studies are showing that most of the materials and energy used during the life cycle of a computer specifically are used during the manufacturing. So, for example, up to 81% of the energy used throughout the entire lifespan of a computer might be used in the manufacturing phase. So that's incredible. So when we put our computers in power save mode, that's great, but most of the energy has already been used. So then end of life comes along, and for those of us who work in technology, just probably almost all of us, we have experience with this, machines aging out of support. So it's really common to see support contracts of about 3 to 5 years. On a cell phone in the US, on a prepaid subsidized phone, and a lifespan is about 2 years. But there's a Gartner study that shows that routers, a lot of networking equipment, will easily last for 7 or 8. But the contracting is such that after 3 years it becomes so expensive to support that there's an incentive for the consumer to buy a new one. So at end of life, the support contract dies, and then maybe 5 years later, the device dies. So then, what happens at the end of the life of our user's computer? She's used it for a couple years, and she's done with it. So she figures, okay, it's time to get that out of my house. So she knows, all right, I shouldn't put it in the trash because there's toxins and stuff that could leach out of it, and I want that to happen. But then what do I do? So she figures, okay, well, whatever I do, I probably don't want my hard drive going out into the world. I don't want my data to be stolen. So she pulls that out and sticks it in the closet. Turns out that in 2007, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimated that something like over 200 million devices were just being stored in people's homes, just in storage. And I'm sure all of us have a computer graveyard somewhere in our houses. So she can trash it, and she chooses not to. She can stash it, but she puts a hard drive in the closet. She could donate it, but she realizes that, okay, if I donate it, then the next person who has this device, when it dies, they're going to be responsible for it, and I don't know if I want to do that. So then she figures, okay, I'll recycle it. So she starts calling around and finds out that recycling facilities charge about $10 to $30 US to take an old computer, and this is in the US. It may be very different in the EU. So she's like, well, this is a free computer. Why should I pay to get rid of it? So finally, her local town has a recycling event, and you can just come and take your computer and dump it for free, and that sounds great. So as far as she is concerned, she takes it to the municipal dump, and they take care of it. They're going to recycle it. Sounds great. But the problem is, what the user doesn't understand is that the recycling of this product is actually extremely expensive. So if she is getting it recycled for free, one of a couple of things is happening. Either her city is picking up the bill for the recycling, or an unreputable recycler is taking the stuff and doing stuff with it that they shouldn't do, like reselling it when it should be just junked or recycled. So in that case of these unreputable recyclers, what often happens is the machine gets exported somewhere. And I'm talking about largely from a developed world perspective, but we'll see that this also is a big problem in the developing world. So let's say my American computer is done with, and I take it to the recycling facility, and actually, rather than actually pulling it apart and getting the materials out of it, what happens is that recycler sends it to a foreign market in Asia or Africa typically, where there it'll drive down the prices of local computers, and anything that's junk anything that's junk gets put into their waste system, which may or may not be much of a system at all. With a computer afterlife, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. What we haven't talked about yet is the process of what I call informal recycling, and this is the stuff that you see on the big exposés from the Basel Action Network. There are lots of specials that have happened on American television, like Frontline and 60 Minutes, and there have been a lot of exposés that show how informal recycling happens. So when a piece of junk electronics ends up in a developing nation that doesn't have the infrastructure to handle it, a couple things happen. Enterprising people will come and pick through the junk and pull out the parts that are easiest, like they'll pull off the cases. Then they'll pull components off of the circuit board, possibly by melting it over a little coal-fired stove with no respirator, releasing the lead in the solder out into the air. Then to pull the gold off of the circuit boards, what they might then do is dip the thing in aqua regia, which is a mixture of sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, which precipitates the gold into a solution. And then there's another chemical process that you do to precipitate the gold back out. It dissolves the gold and then you precipitate it back out. And where does the waste acid go? Possibly into the Lianjiang River in Guayu, China. There just isn't the infrastructure to deal with this stuff in these markets, but economic situations are such that it's viable for people to do this, to get money for scrap gold, scrap copper, scrap iron, steel, whatever. So how do we start with a device that, costs maybe 1,000 euros to begin with and has all this good stuff in it? How does it end up harming people, places, and markets in these crazy ways? And it's because of a couple of things. Product design takes the use phase of a product into account and not the disposal phase. So product design and life cycle are pretty well connected. And the way that we price things just isn't appropriate. We don't capture the true cost of a lot of the products that we use. So there's some good news and some bad news. The bad news is electronic waste is very clearly an environmental tragedy and environmental injustice. However, it's also an economic inefficiency, and we'll take a look at how the economics work with this in a couple of minutes. Last, however, and this is what makes me really excited. There's a lot of green investment opportunity here, and we'll see how this plays out when we look at recycling versus virgin materials. So the stuff. This is a picture of a recycler that's in my area. This is the recycler that my employer uses. They're called Elemental. They seem perfectly great, and this is just a couple shots that I took up at their warehouse. So the stuff. How much stuff do we make? It's hard to measure this stuff. So first of all, because it's trash, but also because we just don't have good metrics to measure it. So the best that people usually do when they're studying this stuff is multiply sales data by the lifespan of a device. Now, sales data is coming from vendors, so it's not necessarily coming from a vetted source, but it's the best source of data that we have. So some good guesses about how much electronic waste we have around us is that in the US, it comes out to about 24, maybe more than that, devices per home. And the EPA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, estimates that between 2003 and 2010, we ended up with about 3 billion units of e-waste. In the EU, in 2005, we were seeing about 8.3 to 9.1 million tons of e-waste per year. By 2012, that could be up to 12.3 million tons per year. However, this isn't just a developed world problem. There are estimates that show that by 2030, the amount of electronic waste being produced in developing countries could be double that of the sort of Western countries that we're used to talking about. Okay, so there's good stuff, bad stuff, and ugly stuff. So the good stuff in electronic waste, there's lots of good stuff in it. So this little graph here shows that there's a decent amount of ferrous materials. There's a lot of aluminum. There's glass, which is extremely recyclable. Aluminum is also extremely, well, these are all very recyclable things. Plastics, less so. And that other category is things that occur in smaller amounts like lead, cadmium, all sorts of antimony, lots of little stuff. But you can see that there's a lot of recyclable stuff in here. So the good stuff is hard to get to because you have to get past the bad stuff. And so these are some materials that are found in computers that are on the U.S. RCRA Resource Conservation and Recovery Act list of hazardous materials. RCRA is also known as Superfund. So these are Superfund materials, and this is really nasty stuff. You might already know that lead is a really bad neurotoxin. All these things, cadmium, cobalt, mercury, you don't want them in your system. You don't want them in your water system. So I mentioned Guayu, China, which, if you're familiar with this topic, is a name of a place that you've heard before. Guayu is considered the world capital of e-waste processing, and so there are a lot of backyard recyclers. And so backyard recycling started in Guayu, I want to say around like the early 2000s, 2001 or something like that. So the soil has so much crud in it, and by crud I mean things like cadmium, chromium, lead, that the soil itself is considered hazardous waste under some definitions. There's footage of a documentary by the Basel Action Network called Exporting Harm, which is very famous. I recommend you take a look at it if you have a chance. There's footage of a researcher sticking a pH strip into the water of the Lianjiang River and pulling it out, and it reading 0. That's about as acidic as water can get. And this is a river that used to provide drinking water. Residents say that in about a year after e-waste recycling started, the drinking water just became undrinkable. Farmers there don't feed the food that they've grown to their families or their community. They try and export it out because they know that if they eat it, they're going to get sick. This isn't just a Chinese problem. This isn't just a West African problem. Silicon Valley is also extremely contaminated. I can't remember the exact numbers, but there's an incredible number of lawsuits under the Superfund law that have taken place in Silicon Valley because of all the contamination that's entered the waterway and the soils due to electronics manufacturing. So it gets even uglier. So plastics are pretty complicated, and I'll leave that discussion for later if we want to talk about it, but flame retardants are known to be extremely carcinogenic and very tenacious. There have been studies that show that all of us have a little bit of flame retardants in us, and even breast milk shows, it's like Scotchgard shows up in breast milk and has for many, many years. So, and it gets pretty bad. Where I'm talking about commingled substances here, another reason that it's so hard to pull waste apart is that when you have a capacitor, for example, and you want to pull the tantalum out of it, it's commingled with other stuff. And there's gold sitting on circuit boards, and what I'm saying here is that devices have elements that are commingled with other elements, and it's just chemically and mechanically very hard to pull them apart. So there's also conflict materials. You've heard of conflict diamonds, diamonds that come from areas that are under rebel control, that sort of thing. Well, the same thing is happening with coltan, which is the mineral from which tantalum is derived, and tantalum is the main ingredient in capacitors. And there was actually a big tantalum price spike in about 2000, 2001, because I believe that's when the fighting got really bad in the Republic of Congo, which is where a lot of tantalum comes from. So if you want to think conflict materials, you could be thinking conflict coltan. You can also be thinking conflict rare earth elements, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And if you want to be talking about peak oil, peak tantalum again is a big concern, where it's getting harder to find. And you want to talk about mountaintop removal for coal. Gold mining is incredibly damaging as well. So why are you looking at a huge orange circle? Because if you look at the sort of 12 o'clock line there, you might see a teeny tiny little sliver of something that looks a little whitish on this screen. What this is talking about is that orange portion is the weight of the materials and fuel that go into making like a DIMM, a memory chip, and that's 630 times the weight of the actual chip itself. So this is by a study. This is from a study that a guy named Eric Williams and his colleagues did. Eric Williams is one of the big experts in this field, and one of the things that he said after this paper was published is that when you look at numbers like this, you start to understand that the idea of dematerialization, which is the idea that this laptop is tiny, so we must be reducing our pollution load, we must be reducing our material load on the world, doesn't actually make sense. It doesn't bear out. So this one I didn't even try to make visually accurate. What this is showing is that that's the size of a gold ring. 0.33 ounce gold ring is about 9 grams. That big one over there is the amount of waste that's required to mine about that much gold. This comes from the No Dirty Gold campaign, and they got their numbers from a combination of industry and government numbers. And there are other numbers that bear that out. If you don't believe these numbers, I'd be happy to talk about some others. For example, surface mining can result in about 2.6 million tons of waste per ton of gold. So when you're looking at gold mining, you're looking at tremendous earth moving, tremendous interruption in the environment. But on the other hand, so let's see. What this is showing us is that the gold richness in geologic ore is much less efficient than the gold richness in circuit boards. So if you take 17 tons of mining ore, like geologic, dirt in the ground, you get about the same amount of gold as you would in a ton of circuit boards. But some numbers say that maybe it's actually 40 to 1. And some numbers say it might be 800 to 1. Now, I'm not totally sure where all these numbers come from, except that I got them from the US Geological Survey. So this could depend on everything from soil richness to the type of mining to who's reporting the numbers. But even if we look at this most conservative estimate, that's pretty good. So let's talk about the value embedded in electronic waste. So here, this is another picture from that same recycler. They're actually more of a disassembler. So this is just some gold heat sinks, copper heat sinks. So there's a lot of value in electronic waste. This guy, Komei Harada, from the National Institute of Material Science in Japan in 2010 was quoted in an article that I can look up for you, that he is guesstimating that perhaps 16% of the world's gold reserves might be stuck in e-waste. Personally, my gut feeling is that that might be a little optimistic, but even if it's half that, if it's a quarter of that, that's a pretty significant storehouse of gold. And if we see that it's at least 17 times more efficient or more rich than geologic ore, we have a lot of opportunities sitting in front of us. This quote becomes really interesting in a couple minutes when we start to talk about rare earths. Japan's economy has grown by gathering resources from around the world, and those resources are still with us in one form or another. It's kind of, it's a little zen, but the point here is that Japan is a small country with not a whole lot of physical mineral resources, and what they've gathered from imports. So you can see that we're starting to talk about using electronic waste as this storehouse of materials and commodities. So what I'm going to talk about in a moment is the rare earth oxide feeding frenzy that happened in 2010. I'm also going to expand on this idea that electronic waste is this storehouse of ore by talking about this idea of urban mining or anthropogenic ore. Anthropogenic, of course, meaning being derived from human activity. Urban mining is an idea that the UN Environment Program is becoming very fond of. However, the UN is also finding that we have enormous data gaps as far as figuring out how much materials, how much metal we have around in society. So, for example, there are certain metals like nickel, and literally nobody in the world knows how much of it we've mined. We just have no idea. I'm also going to talk about externalized costs. And that's a concept that will be familiar to some of you and maybe not so much to some others. We'll go through it. So the second portion of my thesis was about specifically about the role of rare earths in electronic waste, and even more specifically than that, I was looking at a rare earth embargo that happened between China and Japan, and a little bit between China and the US and EU in late 2010. So what happened was there was, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a little political scuffle between China and Japan where there was like a fishing trawler or something that went into contested waters, and I think like Japan took a Chinese captain hostage or took him to jail, or the other way around. But in any case, there was this little domestic diplomatic scuffle, and one of the things that happened very coincidentally was that the next day or the next week or something, China just stopped shipping rare earths to Japan. They just stopped. And when asked to explain, kind of how this happened, the Chinese government was like, "Oh, we don't know. Well, maybe all 32 exporters decided at the same time that this was a patriotic thing to do." Yeah, okay, maybe not. Nobody really believes that. So let's talk about what rare earths are and why this embargo was significant. So rare earth elements are 15 elements called in the lanthanide group on the periodic table. Thank you. Plus yttrium and scandium, and they kind of hang off of the lanthanides on the periodic table, but they're included because they have very similar characteristics. So rare earths were once thought to be quite rare. They're actually not at all rare, but they're incredible. But they're quite rare to find in mineable quantities. And in fact, nowhere in the world is there a rare earth mine, except maybe in California, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But everywhere in the world, rare earths are only a co-product or a byproduct of some other mining. So in the biggest mines in China, there's a very big mine out in Mongolia, biggest Mongolia, where the rare earths come out of an iron mine. So they geologically, they just happen to occur within these particular soil conditions. So to get into the rarity thing again, the most common rare earth, I believe, is cerium, I want to say. Anyway, so it's about as common as copper, and the most rare earths are about 200 times more abundant than gold. So you can see that they're not that rare, but they're just incredibly difficult to pull out of the ground because they just don't occur in bulk. So rare earths obviously go into rare earth magnets, but they also go into all sorts of electronics, and they're critical for renewable energy because without rare earths you can't make big magnets, and without big magnets you can't have big light magnets, and without big light magnets you can't have wind turbines, for example, and it's very difficult to make a hybrid car. So you see rare earths showing up in everything from the catalytic converter in your neighbor's car to cell phones to wind turbines, lighting. Rare earths are, they're in demand the way that they are because they have very, very specific characteristics that are just about impossible to replicate in other materials. And as I mentioned, they're incredibly intensive to purify. There was a mine in California called the Mountain Pass mine. It was run by a company called Molycorp, which is trying to reopen the mine right now. And at their worst, they were producing something like 850 gallons of wastewater per minute. Now, this is in a situation where some of these materials are radioactive. So some of this wastewater is radioactive. This is unbelievable. The amount of intensity that's required. Another little thing. So to get rare earths out of, they come in kind of a chemical clump. The minerals kind of come in a clump of maybe 7 to 9 to 15 elements together. So to pull them apart, because their characteristics are distinct but very similar, you have to do these incredibly intense processes like boil them over and over and over at temperatures of 140 to 220 degrees Celsius in a combination of hydrochloric acid and what's the other big acid? Well, anyway, in aqua regia, essentially. So, and you might have to do this 200 times to get out a distinct rare earth element. So I talked about this embargo that sent prices through the roof. Some estimates are all over the place because the prices are continuing to shift, but one estimate showed that in the last 2 years, prices might have gone up by about 12 times. And you can see that even before that, prices were doing a little dance all the way up and down the economy for a long time. And we'll look at why this price craziness was happening. So how did prices jump up by 12 times in the last 2 years? Well, over the past, let's see, 20 years, China has been slowly pulling together their rare earth market. So what happened was in the 1980s, after, as communism was sort of, going by the wayside, I think it was it Deng Xiaoping? Anyway, one of the Chinese leaders started to understand and started to publicize and talk about in public the fact that rare earths were going to be China's gold. They were going to be China's oil. And so starting in about 1980, rare earths, which were primarily produced in the U.S. and a couple other countries, China started to slowly creep up, and the U.S. started to slowly creep down. And this happened in a couple of ways. One, their production just went up. But two, they started undercutting prices in other markets. Now and driving lots of other producers out of the market. Now that might sound like a grand, conspiratorial plan. It's not quite what happened. There may have been some of that, but the other thing that happened was that the marketeers in China were trying to undercut each other, even at a loss, like a net loss for China, because they were trying to get their portion of the market, and that's having some pretty bad repercussions for China now. So. As of right now, China owns about 95 to 97% of the rare earth capacity in the world. And we just talked about the 2010 embargo. And for reasons that are totally legit from an environmental and a political perspective, they want to start decreasing their production, but demand for rare earths is going through the roof. Moore's law applies to materials as much as it does to processor speed. So where are the rare earths? I apologize for the tiny little text here, but what we can see here is that that big chunk over there, the green portion, the dark green portion right here, that shows about 50% of the reserves of rare earths, that's China. The US is the blue. Above that little thing, I apologize for the people who don't see color too well. And let's see, the other big chunk over there is other countries. This dark colored one is Russia and associated countries. So you can see, I mean, this is not terribly diverse, but the reserves are spread out around the world. But this is production. And seeing the 95 to 97% that we talked about before, this isn't surprising. China's producing almost all of it. So now I want to kind of switch gears from rare earths and talk about what the value of a thing entails. We tree huggers like to talk about not just a product, not just an object, but we like to talk about all the resources that went into making the object. So my fancy water bottle, it's a few grams. It's made of steel. It's got a little plastic. It's got some inks, and inside is water. But this object represents all this other stuff, all this other material and energy that went into making this. So you can think of this little water bottle as embodying a huge amount of other stuff and energy. And there are lots of interesting ways that environmentalists have tried to quantify this and talk about it. One way is the idea of an ecological rucksack. So if you can imagine this water bottle carrying around with it, its baggage of all the stuff that went into producing it, then you can start to appreciate that there's a lot that went into this. Embodied energy. So the amount of energy that went into mining the steel, purifying the steel, or mining the iron, purifying the steel, extruding it, whatever, that's called the embedded energy. So there might be X number of megajoules embedded in this water bottle. Another idea that we talk about is virtual water. So I have an apple in my bag. So that apple required so many gallons of water for the fertilizer, for the apple itself, for the transportation. So while there might be only a couple of milliliters of water in the apple, that apple represents many gallons of water. So its virtual water measurement is much higher than the water actually in the apple. I'll skip over ecosystem services, but if we want to talk about it, please feel free when we do a little Q&A. So the reason that environmentalists are really excited about talking about these embedded ways of talking about outcomes and products is that economics, the way that our economics work, just doesn't deal with this very well. And the reason it doesn't deal with it very well is because we have tons of inefficiencies in our economics in the form of externalities. So an externality is something, is a value of a product that isn't reflected in its price. So say, for example, I sell you a painting on eBay, and I sell it to you for 20 bucks, but I don't know that it's this, you know, it's a Jackson Pollock, and to me it's just a bunch of scribbles on a canvas. So when you buy that from me for $20, you have this positive externality of, you know, thousands of dollars because you've bought this expensive thing from me that wasn't reflected in the price because I didn't know any better. So what about a negative externality? What if I own a house in a neighborhood and you come in and buy the property right next to me that used to be a community garden, but you really want a parking space? So that might drive down my property values. So you might have paid, I don't know, let's say 50,000 euros for this property that you're going to put a parking space on, but you just brought down my property value by 10,000 euros. So I'm suffering a negative externality from your actions. So that's the idea of externalities. And externalities happen all the time in the free market, and that's why I'm saying that the free market is not free as in beer, especially if you're the one suffering a negative externality. So here I've tried to talk a little bit about trying to show that, like, when we get down to the point of e-waste, a lot of the materials that went into the product have dissipated or have failed to be reflected in the actual object. That idea of, like, you know, 630 times the amount of materials and energy go into a chip than is reflected in the size of the chip itself. So here I'm looking at, at the top we've got huge amounts of raw materials that are used. Then we've got large amounts of energy used during the production. Then we've got the use phase, and then we've got the disposal phase. And then in the U.S., 82% of e-waste is landfilled. 18% gets recycled, much of which is exported. But it's getting really expensive to do this. So gold prices continue to go up. However, the percentage of gold used in industrial and technical applications has stayed about the same. So as the gold market grows, as the amount of gold in society grows, and as the price continues to go up, that chunk that's used for technology just keeps on trucking along, which means that the chunk that's used for technology and industry continues to get more and more valuable every year. So the human costs of raw material extraction are pretty incredible. And I'm not going to get into that a whole lot today, but I encourage you to look into it if that's something that interests you. Mining there are just so many fights about mining. A lot of communities are getting stepped on by large mining companies. The effects of mining are just incredible in terms of destruction of agricultural soils, hydrology, all sorts of stuff. And we already talked about conflict minerals a little bit. So if we talk about mining, it's also difficult from the business end because you got crazy lawsuits, particularly in the U.S., but I'm sure this happens in other parts of the world, where it's just really expensive and very time-consuming to come up with a new mine. So as far as rare earths go, people in the U.S. are estimating that it's gonna take about 15 years to open a new rare earth mine. So that's 15 years that we could be putting into recycling research. So why not do that? And one of the reasons we don't do that is because the market doesn't want to work that way. It doesn't understand these values that we as humans have. The market is actually kind of a sociopath, and that's where people like me tend to think that the role of regulation really comes into play. So regulation might be a dirty word to lots of people, but regulation is the reason that we can drink the water around here. Regulation is the reason that the air isn't full of smog the way it is in a lot of places that we may have traveled to. Okay, so I believe that regulation, when you put it in the right places, can internalize those externalized costs and can spark changes. And in fact, it does create markets. In the US, we have this idea of cap and trade for air pollution. The idea is that if you want to put so many millions of tons of air pollution into the air in 1 year, and that's above your quota, then you can buy that from somebody else. Which sounds like a crazy idea, but believe it or not, study after study after study has found that this works. It actually reduces pollution. So it's a way to make a market out of a place where the costs were just externalized to all of us as a society and as a global community. So regulation internalizes costs. We can talk about that a little bit more in more detail during question and answer, but let's just keep going. One role of regulation is to enforce producer take-back. So let's say that, like, the vendor is either forced or has the opportunity, or both, to take back their stuff. A lot of manufacturers would actually really like to get their stuff back because they know exactly what's in it, they know exactly where it is, and if they can pull it out and reuse it, that's cheaper for them. We want to talk about, regulation would like to talk about design for the environment. So let's design our stuff so that it's not just designed for the use phase, so that it is designed for easier disassembly at the end of its life. And there are some regulations that are talking about reduction of toxins, which is a non-trivial issue, and I'd like to talk about that with you as an audience a little bit. So here's a revised version of the graphic that we saw a little bit ago. And here you can see that in a couple of places we've injected regulation. So we've put regulation up into the urban mine extraction portion so that we're not just relying on geologic ore to pull raw materials out of the earth. We're also pulling it from the trash that we've already made. Regulation can help do that. Regulation in the production phase can spur design changes, efficiencies in manufacturing, all sorts of stuff. Regulations in the disposal phase can increase collection and can make it easier for people to hand in their stuff, can make it economically viable for regular people to do that. And when we end up with that, we could end up with a reversal of those numbers that we saw before. We could see 20% of e-waste landfilled instead of 80%, and 80% recycled instead of 18%. And that recycled stuff goes right back up to the beginning. So, what are the regulations that already exist? Somebody has to have thought of this, right? They have. At the international level, the biggest regulatory, the most effective regulatory instrument that exists is the Basel Convention. It was a convention that I think it started in the early 1980s after some tanker full of all sorts of toxic crap exploded in some ocean, and it was terrible. So anyway, so the Basel Convention has been around for quite a while, and it manages the production, the management, and the movement of hazardous materials. 172 nations have ratified it, so it's a very popular convention. And guess who has signed it but not ratified it? The US. But, you know, that's not news. In the EU, actually, I will tell you what I know about EU regulation, but during the question and answer, I would absolutely love to hear more about you from the EU crowd, what you think about all of this stuff, because I haven't dealt with it on a first-hand basis. So in the EU, there are two big regulations that cover the 27 or so nations that are considered EU nations now, and they are WEEE and RoHS. The WEEE regulation is waste, electrical and electronic equipment. RoHS is restriction of hazardous substances. And WEEE essentially says, it enforces producer take-back, so it says that the manufacturer has to take back their stuff at the end of the life of the product. RoHS says you can't put toxic crap in your stuff anymore. And it says, okay, we're not going to tell you that you can't put any toxic stuff in it, but every couple of years, we're going to look at the science, we're going to look at the material science, and where there are reasonable substitutes for toxic substances, we're going to ask you to put those in. Lead is a really famous example. It's non-trivial to make these chemical substitutions. When you take lead out of solder, you have to put in some, other metals. and generally non-leaded solder melts at a much higher temperature, and sometimes there's crystallization, so sometimes you get failure of devices that wouldn't have failed with leaded solder, but the lead is out of it. So, so these changes are non-trivial, but I think that they're very important. So we and ROS, when they got instantiated in around 2001, 2002, caused a very interesting race to the top. What happened was that international business players in the tech scene started to realize that, okay, we have a market in Europe, and it doesn't make any sense for us to have one production line for Europe and one production line for the rest of the world. So I don't know, I guess let's just make all of our stuff comply with the European regulations. And from an American perspective, we drool over this stuff because our regulations are so bad. So I'm really interested to hear what you all think of these regulations. We're seeing WEEE collection rates of something like 16 to 65%, whereas in the US, again, it's more like 18%. And that big stretch there is because the way that WEEE is measured depends on a lot of things. So there might be 16% of washers and dryers collected, but 65% of cell phones collected, something like that. And every couple of years, researchers from the UN and contractors that are hired by the EU look at these laws and renew them and try and figure out how to make them work better. One thing they found a couple of years ago in a study was that the biggest cost of implementing this stuff wasn't R&D, it wasn't like material development, it was compliance, which could make you very angry or very optimistic. If compliance is your biggest cost, that means that you're wasting a lot on bureaucrats. If compliance is your biggest cost, it means you have a lot of cost savings coming your way as you figure out how to do this better. So in the US, we have really crappy regulations. We have this one little rule called the CRT rule, cathode ray tube rule, that basically says if you're going to ship one of these big old monster monitors to somewhere else, you have to call them and let them know. And there's a loophole that says that if it's destined for reuse, you don't have to call and let them know. And by them, I mean the government, the waste regulation or customs agent in the importing country. The Government Accountability Office totally hates the CRT rule and wants it totally revamped and made better. Another funny thing about US law is that the hazardousness of a material depends on goofy things like who's recycling it or who's dumping it. If I, as a consumer, want to get rid of my laptop, it's not considered hazardous waste, even though it's got cadmium and chromium and lead in it. If my company, if my university wants to dump it, it is considered hazardous waste. And the idea there is that the EPA wants to go after the biggest chunks of waste coming out there, and they want to regulate the biggest quantities of toxins that could be entering the environment. But it's a goofy rule. So US states, you might know them as provinces, but US states have gotten really irritated about all this stuff, and 25 of the 50 states have take-back laws now that say that, the vendor who sold the e-waste has to take it back. But the problem is all the laws are a little different, so it's very expensive to enforce across the board, and it makes it so that some manufacturers are paying much, much more than others. So it's a good start, but we're wasting tons and tons of money and tons of equipment manufacturers' time and energy on trying to comply with all these rules. And a lot of manufacturers would just rather have one big federal rule. So where are we going? This is a bunch of crushed hard drives. And hard drives, as you know, have rare earth magnets in them, neodymium. So this could be one of the places where we're starting to pull rare earths out of our trash. We talked a little bit about urban mining. I very sincerely believe that that's where we're going, that we're going to start mining our trash. We need more accurate pricing. We need to see the true cost of materials reflected in the cost of our manufacturing and all that stuff, so that it becomes economically viable to design for use and for disposal and for reuse. And what we're starting to see already is that price spikes and shortages are going to make it so that, you know, if I leave anything out, on my curb that's copper, it'll be gone in an hour. Neodymium, rare earth magnets, and some of these substances are going to start to become the same way. So there is money to be made because, as we've seen, when you export e-waste, you export commodities. You export expensive stuff. So we talked about rare earths, and we talked about the rare earths price spikes and all this stuff. And US investors right now are absolutely clamoring for more rare earth mines in the US. They think that that's going to solve the problem. It's not. For one, the rare earths that are contained in the mines that we know of, the mineable areas that we know of in the US, only contain a more common type of rare earth, the light elements, as opposed to the heavy elements, which are more rare. So we're not even going to get the most valuable rare earths out of the mines if we get more mines online. So another thing that I'd like to point out is that when people talk about, oh, we need domestic sources of whatever commodity, that sounds a lot like the American argument for we need domestic sources of oil, and I'm sure that happens in lots of other countries. Well, there's a key difference between metals and fossil fuels, which is that metals are recyclable. So if you want a domestic source of gold or neodymium or aluminum, you don't have to look any further than your landfill. That's a domestic source. So there are places that are digging into this in a pretty serious way. Japan, as a result of the rare earth embargo, started kind of freaking out and really putting a lot of R&D into pulling rare earths in particular out of waste. And Hitachi's been working on this with hard drives for a while. And China recently introduced a consumer take-back program where if you bring an old electronic device, you get something like a 10% voucher toward your next device or something like that. So even China, who has been importing this waste and suffering some of the consequences of it for years, are realizing now that they actually want this stuff, that this is a pile of gold and they would like to use it. So what can we do? This geek is not from the developing world. He's from a devolving country called the US. This is another guy from the recycling facility up in Philadelphia. So he's manually taking the circuit boards off of hard drives, and this is one of the manual processes that has to happen. So what we as a global society need to work on this problem is multidisciplinary in the extreme. So we need science and chemistry, we need design geeks, we need industrial designers and product designers, we need appropriate technologists, we need economics, we need policy wonks, and we desperately need entrepreneurs because there is opportunity here and it's not being captured. So on the mechanical chemical end, we need better machines to pull stuff apart. Computers are very compact and they're commingled and they're very difficult to pull into their constituent parts. We need better mechanical separation mechanisms. We need better mechanical separation as well. So I would love to have a vat of stuff in my, maybe not in my house, but in my lab, where I could just, stick a capacitor in it and get some crap out on one side and get some tantalum out on the other side. And people are working on that, but it's not quite there yet. We need smart design to short circuit this terrible cycle that we have of designing just for the use phase, so we need to short circuit that whole design for use and instead of designing for the environment. And we need to figure out how much waste is out there. We need better measurement tools. The EPA likes to say that you measure what you manage and you manage what you measure. We as global citizens don't have those tools. As I was saying before, there's a couple of really wonderful UN Environment Program studies about metals in society, and if you read them, they're fascinating just to see how little we know about metals. So on the appropriate technology side, we talked about informal recycling out in the field and these terribly harmful processes that people use, burning copper cables to get the jackets off and all sorts of terrible things. So we need appropriate technology people to develop in-field harm reduction processes. So can the hardware hackers in the room and in the community, can we start coming up with like bicycle-powered copper sheath separators? Can we start to come up with better chemical methods for pulling gold out of circuit boards? Like, what can we do in the field to reduce the harm that's being taken on by people for whom the economics just necessitate that this is going to continue to happen? We desperately need policy. We've talked about that a lot. We've talked about realistic pricing. And we as technology workers can make demands of our vendors. So we can say things like, okay, ship us a crate of stuff and then take the boxes back. Like, don't leave before you take your box with you. We can say things like, we don't want to throw away our stuff at the end of the contract. You bring it back and send us a new piece and give us a discount on the new piece of technology because we're continuing a contract with you. We can make all sorts of demands if we're thinking on a more macro scale and if we're buying together and if we're making demands that are consistent. Our vendors will listen to us, especially if, I work at a large university and we buy tons of computers and we can be making more aggressive demands. So that's about what I have to talk about, which is good. Talked for a little while. These are some of my favorite sources, and these talks are going to be up on the web, so please feel free to take a look at any of these. I also have a couple of copies of my thesis for anyone who's like nerdy enough to want a paper copy, so come up to me afterwards. And just want to say thank you to my University of Pennsylvania, who gave me a very generous grant to come here to CCC, to Stan Laskowski, who is my thesis advisor, and Christina Dunbar-Hester, who is my secondary reader, to the Hope crew, to my home crew, who has helped me read through all these talks, and to CCC. And thank you so much for listening. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say about these topics.
Thank you very much for that very enlightening talk. We do have a few minutes left for Q&A. I would ask everyone to just stand in front of the microphone in the middle of the saal. Well, then I do have a question. Did I understand that right? That I know in everyday's goods there's kind of a gap in the recycling process. At least people tell me that it's basically more expensive to just recycle the goods and sell them to build something new out of it than just pull it out of the earth for good. So is that the same thing with maybe the raw earth or technological waste in general?
Yes, that's absolutely the case, and the reason is that it's so labor-intensive and toxic-intensive to do that separation work that it ends up being quite expensive. Expensive to do domestically, but if it's exported to a country where the labor and environmental laws are weaker, then it's much cheaper to do it there because, again, the costs are externalized onto the people who live there.
We have another question from the audience.
Actually, to go into that a bit deeper, in your talk you spoke mostly about taking the electronic waste product and turning it back into the source materials. But in that process, then you turn them back into functioning components to use in new equipment. Mm-hmm. But the waste product may still contain functioning components that can be repurposed into a new product. So I'm wondering what your ideas about this is, also to eliminate the last step of basically the mining from the waste.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. Part of which is that we could save a lot of energy by simply reusing parts rather than separating them out into their constituents and getting raw materials out of them and then rebuilding them. And that turns into a very significant design question. It turns into a question of modularity. DIMMs, there are some technological pieces that are very modular, like DIMMs, hard drives, a couple other things. And we've just decided that we want some of our technological components to be modular. But the industry has decided that they want a lot of components to not be interchangeable. Things like processors, buses, physical connectors. it's a design problem that a lot of our components are not reusable. I think it's a very serious design problem, but that comes from the manufacturers, and they have a profit motive to not make those things reusable.
But for instance, the past month on Hackaday, there were a few tutorials on how to desolder small components from broken motherboards, for instance. So you can take capacitors that are still functional and you can use them for new projects. But what about putting this concept within the recycle flow that functioning components could be tested and repurposed in new circuit boards or whatever? So then you don't put the energy in extracting the rare materials and then making another capacitor. Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that idea. There are problems in making it work on the large scale. Again, design problems, also labor problems. A lot of recycling facilities do exactly what you're talking about, though, and send different components to be reused. But the problem is the entire manufacturing cycle has to be able to buy into that in some way. So for each component that you have to sell, there has to be a buyer to buy that, and that buyer has to have bought into that system enough to want that modular piece in their new product. So making that work on a large scale is not without complication, but I think you're totally right on. I think that's what we should be doing.
Where it could be cheaper to actually, for instance, for a smaller company to get maybe less quality components to make the product compared to mining the raw materials and then producing the, so yeah.
I would love to see that happen.
Okay, we have another question from the audience.
You mentioned how some of the recycling is happening in the backyard over an open fire without respirator. Not that I'm planning on doing this at home, but what was the acid used to dissolve the circuit board?
Yeah, actually, I meant to mention at the beginning of this talk, this wasn't going to be about alchemy or metallurgy, but it's aqua regia, which is a combination of sulfuric and hydrochloric acid. There's a particular proportion. I think it's like 30% sulfuric, 70% hydrochloric. I'm not totally sure. But I mean, this is something that happens in labs. Aqua regia is a pretty standard material. So, I mean, you could do it, but seriously do it with a chemical hood. Like, seriously.
Okay, another question?
Hi, I was just interested that you said that it's the less ethical companies that are sending off stuff to be reused. Because in England, it's actually usually presented as a more ethical situation. You know, they'll say openly, send off your mobile phones, send off your laptops to be reused. And charities collect them. So, you know, it would be seen as a green environmental thing. They always say, you know, reduce and then reuse and then recycle.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, is there ways of... I hadn't really seen it in this light, basically. So is there anything you would...
Like, how do you make reuse jibe with how this whole system works?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really sticky question, and your moral ambiguities about this are actually right on the money. So reuse, from an environmental perspective, is the #1 thing that you can do to make the world a better place. Absolutely, no doubt about it. The problem is that computer reuse suffers the same economic problems that clothing reuse does, for example. You may or may not be familiar with the issue of clothing donation to, there are all sorts of markets around the world that have banned the importing of used clothing from the US and the EU, because when all this clothing comes into a local market, it depresses the local textile market and drives those people out of business. And I don't want to necessarily discourage you from trying to send your recyclables to be reused, but systemically, there's not an easy answer to that.
Okay, the last question.
Sure.
Yeah, you said that the market are like sociopaths, but I mean there's a reason for that, and that's that part of the markets are sociopath in some way because they are, for example, indoctrinated by advertising, and that's, I mean, that's really the point that has to be attacked. When people don't realize that planned obsolescence is basically an anti-consumer tactic, and it's basically anti-everyone who doesn't
who doesn't work for that company, sure.
Yeah. So it's a lot of mentality problem and the problem of missing transparency, that you don't see where the stuff is coming from. And there was a project a while, and it seems kind of dead now, but it's called Source Map, which was kind of an approach to look where the stuff came from, and also how the price comes together, I think.
That's cool. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely needed to, we need to know and not so much trust some regulations that we cannot regulate ourselves.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that I, in a sort of snarky, schmirky kind of way, call markets sociopathic is that I am obviously not familiar with European corporate law, but American corporate law says that a corporation is beholden to its owners. In some cases, that's its stock, usually its stockholders. So even if a company wants to make a socially responsible decision, their board may prevent them from doing that. The corporate law, their corporate governance may prevent them from making a decision that's good for everybody because it might be bad for their bottom line. It's a great example of the Ben & Jerry's ice cream company in the US that I won't get into right now, but if you'd like to know more about it, we can talk later.
Okay, I guess that's it for this talk. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you so much.